Welcome to the Working Tools Podcast, where today we will have part 2 of our interview with Josephine Andrews, Supreme Secretary for Job's Daughters International and past Grand Guardian for Job's Daughters International in Washington.
Ladies and gentlemen, brethren all, welcome to the Working Tools Podcast, a casual conversation around Freemasonry. First, it's important to note that our thoughts and opinions are our own and do not reflect those of our Grand Lodge or respective craft or concordant bodies. Please connect with us and ask questions via our website at theworkingtoolspodcast.com.
So today on the Working Tools Podcast, we have our usual collection of hosts. We have very much brother Stephen Chung from Prince Charles Lodge up in Kelowna, BC. Brother Craig Graham from Kalamalka Lodge number 160 in Vernon, BC. David Colbeth from King Solomon 60 in Auburn, Washington. And I'm Matt Appel. I'm a member of Mill Creek 243 up in Montlake Terrace, Washington. And we have with us again Josephine Andrews, who's like I said just a minute ago, the Supreme Secretary for Job's Daughters International. Josephine, thank you again for being on the show.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys having me and having this opportunity to cover more about Job's Daughters.
So, well, speaking of which, I've said it a couple of times now that you're the Supreme Secretary for Job's Daughters International. Oh, what does that mean? I'm my lodge secretary.
I think that's like lodge. It means she makes everything happen.
There you go.
I do nothing. I wish. Supreme Secretary is actually an honorary title that the Supreme Guardian appoints about 12, I think it is, officers for the year. So it's a one-year term, and the elected team decides who is going to be appointed. I would like to think that I was selected because Washington Job's Daughters has been an amazing place. We grew in the time that I was in Grand Guardian and in the term following it, and really saw some really great success with membership. And coming out of COVID, that was a tough time to be a Grand Guardian. Not as tough as being the Grand Guardian during COVID, but bringing everybody back to in-person and thriving and doing things together. So as Supreme Secretary, it is not like Grand Lodge Secretary. I actually get to sign nothing, post nothing, stamp nothing, but it is a true honor and pleasure to have been selected to represent Washington Job's Daughters at the international sessions and as part of the international team.
So, so past Grand Guardian, that's essentially the head honcho for the state. Is that like a one-year term like it is for the Masons, or is it a multi-year?
It is very similar to the Grand Master of Masons in Washington. So we are elected as Grand Marshal, Grand Guide, Vice Grand Guardian, and then Grand Guardian is the usual process. So it ends up being a total of a 4-year commitment, with the last year being 1. And then Grand Guardian is essentially president of Washington Job's Daughters in layman's terms, and you are there to serve the young ladies of that jurisdiction, help the adults learn what it means to be on the council, keep the records, keep Bethel strong and healthy and focused on having a fun time, and really making sure that we're dotting the I's and crossing the T's in terms of financials, record keeping, reporting, things that also document the history of Job's Daughters for future generations to read and consider, and keep us compliant with things like the IRS, as we are a 501c3 organization, and that's a really important part of making sure that that's happening as well, and simply being judicious about funds and how we're raising money and making sure that the jurisdiction's operating fully.
You described the sort of the line that you went through, the 4 positions from, which as Masons we're all familiar with, because the Grand Lodges function in a very similar way. You sort of put your name forward for Grand Junior Warden or Junior Grand Warden, and then move through. But with an organization like Job's Daughters, where you've got the young girls, do each of those positions sort of have a shadow position of a young girl that kind of does something similar, but sort of your helper, or did you follow what I mean by that?
I do. Absolutely. So all of the positions in a Grand Guardian Council also exist in the Grand Bethel of Washington. So the difference of Grand Guardian Council is the adults. Grand Bethel is the daughters, and not every jurisdiction in the United States or internationally is a grand jurisdiction that has its own criterias, but Washington has been since 1933. And in Washington, the Grand Bethel has a position for every office that a Bethel has. So there are very, very strong correlations. There's a couple of exceptions in the grand elected line that I just described. Vice Grand Guardian, there is no vice Bethel office because we have a pairing of a man and a woman. There's always a Master Mason that partners with a woman to be Grand Guardian and Associate Grand Guardian. So there's just a couple nuances where it doesn't quite tick and tie. So, for example, when you're Grand Guardian, your counterpart would be Grand Bethel Honor Queen. But we also have a Miss Washington, Job's daughter, and she may be considered the partner for the Associate Grand Guardian, but it's really the four of them as a team. But for the most part, it's about like a 95% match office to office.
And then you said that has existed in Washington since 1933. So that's actually Washington has obviously been a very active jurisdiction and has quite well thought out its administration.
Yeah, it's existed for a long time, and we were here and active when British Columbia gentlemen actively initiated and instituted their first Bethel and went from Job's Daughters to Job's Daughters International, or Job's Daughters has had a couple of names over the years. It actually was International Order of Job's Daughters when British Columbia became Job's Daughters jurisdiction. And then later in the early 2000s, when we adjusted our tax status with the IRS, it became Job's Daughters International and flipped international to the end of the title. So it used to be IOJD, and now it's JDI.
Okay.
And at the international level, do you have a similar structure? Is there a similar structure in the adults as well as the youth?
Yes. So a Supreme Bethel is exactly like a Grand Bethel, but the title simply says Supreme Treasurer, Supreme First Messenger, Supreme whichever station. And Grand Bethel does the same thing. It mirrors off of a Bethel level. So you have a Bethel Treasurer, a Grand Bethel Treasurer, and a Supreme Bethel Treasurer. And then at the adult level, we have a Jurisdictional Guardian Council or a Grand Guardian Council and a Supreme Guardian Council. And the Supreme Guardian Council is led and managed, and if you will, the president of that is the Supreme Guardian, currently Jennifer Seelock from Illinois, and she is the leader or president of Job's Daughters International, along with her counterpart, the Associate Supreme Guardian, which is Brad Bingham, and the two of them lead Job's Daughters internationally.
And is that also like a 1-year gig, or is it longer than that?
It's usually a 4-year process. So Supreme Marshal, Supreme Guide, Vice Supreme Guardian, and then Supreme Guardian for the ladies. And each of those roles is 1 year. There's an assumption of progression, but it's not technically that you are automatically elected to the next. You do have to put your name forward again to be eligible and then elected to that office.
So now's the time for me to make a horrible admission. We're a Rainbow family. My mother-in-law, my wife, and my daughter were in Rainbow. So in Rainbow, from the outside looking in, not having been involved as a youth, obviously, there seems to be the adult positions seem to last longer than a year. That's not just one of the differences between the organizations, basically?
I think that's a fairly good distinction of a difference between the two. First, I want to say I wasn't in Rainbow, but a very, very dear friend of mine were the advisor while I was Honored Queen when we were kids. And I think the world of Rainbow as an organization as well. And if my mom had let me do both, she did not. But if she let me do both, I would have done both happily and heartily. So I think that the Masonic Youth, all three of the Masonic Youth groups are absolutely upstanding and outstanding organizations and have nothing but amazing things to say about all of them. For me, Rainbow, a big difference is that when you become a Supreme Deputy, you are Supreme Deputy for a long time. And I don't personally know the process for how one changes into or out of a role like that, but it does last much, much longer than Job's Daughters. Job's daughters, most roles are 1 year, and you can be reappointed to various things. In Washington State, I can speak very heartily that at a Bethel Council level, if you are one of the 5 primary executive council members or advisory board members, if you will, you can be in that exact office for 3 years. You could be on the board for a long time and move from position to position to position, but you can only be Bethel Guardian, for example, for a 3-year in a row. So you could do one on, one off, one on, one off, for as long as you'd like, but if you're going to do it back to back, it limits to 3.
And I think it's important that the general public listeners know that these are all 100% volunteer roles. They do not get paid for these roles. You know, one of our lodge secretary, he an associate grand guardian for BC, and they did a lot of travel, and that's all on their own dime. I think by the time he went through that cycle you referred to, they spent over $45,000 in expenses just to be there and volunteer for the girls in the organization and to support the organization. And I think that's just an important note to put out there.
Yeah, and it can vary quite a bit for each jurisdiction, right? If you're smaller, like let's say Delaware, you may not have as many travel, you may not have as many overnight stays in hotels, things of that nature. I never calculated. I think I didn't really want to know how much I spent.
Don't do the math.
Grand Guardian.
Don't do the math.
But I also had Grand Marshal and half of Grand Marshal, all of Grand Guide, and just a little piece of Vice Grand Guardian during COVID. So I did a lot of time and hours sitting right here in this exact chair at this computer on Zoom meetings night after night after night. And at one point, I actually knew the numbers of hours that I volunteered and number of meetings I attended. And believe me, they're pretty stunning. But it was because I had the privilege of doing 1 hour on a computer instead of a 3-hour drive. You're there for a social hour before, you're at a meeting for an hour and a half, and then you do another social half hour before I get out of the building. I like to be last. I love to talk to people. But that's a big difference when you break it down to 1 hour during the COVID time. So it's pretty phenomenal. But I would say it's been worth every penny, and I've loved it.
Well, and you like, obviously having been a Joby and gone up through those ranks, you're actually getting the opportunity to give back that which you received as a young girl, right? And I got to do, eventually one day I became a chapter dad, and I got to do the same. And I'll tell you, there is nothing more rewarding than being able to do that and to be there for a young individual going through the organization. So hats off to you, and so happy that you get to be able to do that, because there's so much personal reward in that.
Yeah, it's a little less tangible, but you feel it in your heart and your soul. And as these kids were kids and now they're in their 20s and 30s and come back, and we have these very adult conversations about childhood and impact. And I love a little letter that'll come in the mail, or they'll attend a meeting and share something that maybe you've kind of put to the back of your mind, but realizing that those little moments were really big moments for someone else and had a profound impact sometimes is really outstanding. And I've recently taken to reaching out to people that I haven't talked to in a long time, just to say, hi, I'm thinking of you, and take advantage of those moments where someone pops into your mind. Like, it must be for a reason. I should do a quick message and say, I'm thinking of you, even if I don't have time for an hour call. And it's really kind of bear its own fruit and joy and fond memory, walking down memory lane and remembering statewide initiations and Joby weekend trips, and the time I locked the keys in the back of the van and the adults still took me on another trip, and things like that. And that's all part of it. It's all part of it. It's been a
so now
experience.
I gotta ask, just because it's gonna be really hard for you to nail this one down to just one thing, but in your years as a Job's daughter, what is there one most impactful thing that stood out for you before you became an adult participant?
I'm going to go with endurance. And, the story of Job is really about overcoming some adversities. And I had a wonderful fellow sister in Job's Daughters. Her name was Karina. And we went on a road trip, and she was old enough to drive. And this was before driving rules and other things. But her mom was in the car with us, and she couldn't drive a stick shift. So she had to drive her car. But it was overheating in March going over the mountains, and she refused to change cars and had the heater on full blast to blow all of the heat out of the car, and the windows down because the heat was on and the snow was flying in the window. And I was in the back seat thinking I would be in a warm car in a tank top and white shorts. But I happened to be sitting on the sleeping bag because we were packed to the brim. And I remembered pulling that out from under me and wrapping up and cuddling up because the front car windows were open. And life presents challenges, but it's something that you can overcome. And in the moment, I thought I would be frostbitten by the time we got to Grandma's house. But it was really a great moment. And looking back, I realized that things like that were lessons and opportunities and cherishable memories, but I promise you in the moment I was not cherishing it. But she and we walked down that memory lane, and it's fun. It's a lot of fun. I love that.
Yeah. I was actually going to say, Josephine, that story, you're quite lucky, because I can think of any number of 1970s era, horror movies that sort of started off in scenarios like that, broken down car, mountains, bad weather, inappropriately dressed. And yeah, it didn't end well for people. So you came out of that one unscathed. That's pretty good.
Yeah, I think I was even wearing sandals. Like, I was not prepared for what endured, but we made it through.
Yeah, and the story of Job is definitely one of patience. And I'll tell you though, my girls have taught me patience over the years, and so I've learned that one. But I've never been tried as much as Job was, but I don't know how. I don't know if you can give a short and condensed version of the story of Job, or for those that are not aware.
Yeah, I certainly can. So in Job's Daughters, we have offices that the girls each learn lessons. There's 5 positions that we call the 5 messengers. So we call them first, second, third, and fourth, and fifth messenger. And they relay the story of Job and as a lessons of life in Job's Daughters and in the welcoming ceremony. And it's really quite amazing. So the first messenger starts out with the story of Job and his 3 daughters, which is the primary focus, of course, of Job's Daughters, but he also had 7 sons. And in the initial story, it talks about how his children's had feasting and pleasure and joy, and were happy, and he was happy for them, but also wanted to make sure that they loved and feared the Lord, and really got value in that. And the adversary, which is the person or angel or entity that challenges the people on the earth to whether or not you are faithful to God, kind of wanted to challenge Job. And Job, through adversities and trials and losing his children and his oxen and sheep and herds and houses and land, overcame that through his faith in God. And in the end, through a lot of trials and challenges, Job overcame those trials through the adversary and was rewarded by God with twice as much of the world's goods as he had before. But Job's Daughters is founded on a very specific verse, not just the whole story, but we really pay special tribute and value to the 42nd chapter, 15th verse, which says, and I'm going to not quote properly, but as close as I can, in all the land were no women found so amazing as the daughters of Job, that their father gave them inheritance among their brethren. And I think the value for me as a woman in today's society, an adult who can look back and think about life and how we're bringing up young ladies, I love that Job indicated in this passage that his daughters were as equal as his sons. And if you think back to the time of Job, inheritance for women or young ladies, it wasn't a thing, right? So Job saying, look, I've got this much land and this much oxen and sheep, and I'm going to split it amongst all of my children, regardless of gender, I think is a really important thing to to heart for a moment and say that Job believed that girls were just as important as boys. And I think in today's society specifically, we find great value in the importance of treating everyone equally, and women being similar to and or equally to men. And I love that. I'm not a feminist by nature. I didn't really enjoy that class in college either. But I do love the value of saying all of our children are just as important as the other. I love to tell my son that he's my favorite son and she's my favorite daughter, which works great when you only have 2 children. But they are. And I think it's really, really awesome. But I have the pleasure of having had dozens and dozens, maybe even hundreds at this point, of extra children that I think of as my own, even if I didn't mother them in that same way.
Thanks so much for sharing that, because I knew there was no way I was going to be able to portray it as well as you have. That's awesome. And so now, speaking of, you got that extended family from that, and you carried that on into your adult roles in Job's Daughters. And do a lot of the Job's Daughters that you've known over the years, have a lot of them also carried on into the adult portion?
I love that you asked that. I was thinking, how can I tie in Kathy and Kristen to this? So in Joby's, Karina was my big sister, and Joby's and her big sister, we were in the line for the Bethel together to become Bethel Honored Queens. And one of them was Kristen. Her name is now Kristen Dykes. She's currently the Grand Guide elected for Washington Job's Daughters. And we're from the same home, Bethel and Burien. And I love that as her daughter was getting a little bit older and she was seeking a place for her daughter to carry on her tradition of being a part of the Masonic family, reached out, and I invited them to an event, and the plan was for them to go to a Bethel a little closer to them. But as we sat down at our annual camping trip and pulled out bananagrams. We quite love this game. By the way, we take it with us a lot. In fact, I just packed it for convention for DMLA. But we played bananagrams for hours, and her daughter Sarah and my daughter Elizabeth and all these other little Joby to Bees got together and had a great time. And she ended up joining Renton Job's Daughters. In fact, her daughter is currently honored queen of the Bethel. And my daughter was just elected to be honored queen to follow her footsteps. So we're doing it a little bit in reverse for this go round, but both of our daughters are members of the same Bethel. And I love that. And for me, when I was in Job's Daughters, one of the adults, a young adult, was Bethel Guardian. And she's been one of my best friends this whole time, and is my children's godmother. And I really cherish her friendship. Might bring me to tears a little bit, but she has been an absolute pillar, not just as a friend, but as a woman who was a mother before I was a mother. And her guidance and advice and counsel and wisdom, and watching her do the Grand Line and become Grand Guardian 4 years prior to me, so we didn't have any years overlapping in that journey, helped set me up for success and be as successful as I could be in my journey. And to this day, we're still great friends. We live about 12, 15 minutes apart. And these are amazing women that I met in Job's Daughters. Kind of in our earlier episode, we talked about friendship and the friendships we've gained. And I didn't do a sorority in college. That wasn't my pathway, but Job's Daughters was my sorority, and it started all the way back at 7 years old. And I still talk to these women, and I watch them on Facebook, thank goodness, and get to watch their journeys, their careers, their processes, and see them be real estate agents and business women and insurance adjusters and accountants and police officers and military and all of these things. That these are women who, we were just kids. We climbed trees and we painted rocks and we had a good time doing it. And now they're these amazing pillars of society. It's phenomenal thinking back to who we used to be, and Job's Daughters being an instrumental part of making us who we are today.
And speaking of who you are today, I'm sure we're going to be able to probably have a whole other episode on that. But before we do that, and I know you don't really need to tell the senior Jobies that maybe have got busy and drifted away, that how to find your information to come back and get involved, as I'm sure they're invited to. But maybe for those listening, before we wrap this episode up, you could put out the contact and the website information and whatnot, so that anybody who might be interested in learning more about it can at least reach out and find some information.
I love it. Here in Washington, we have a state webpage, but the best one for getting contact information and learning more about getting reinvested and participating, and or for a new member who might be seeking a place for sisterhood, would be joinjobies.org. So that's JOINJOBIES.org. And then internationally, if you're outside of Washington, we'd be happy to pass that information to another jurisdiction, and we do often need to do that. But there's also a jobsdaughtersInternational.org website as well, and that's JOBSDAUGHTERNATIONAL.org. I did pretty good. I was a little worried I was going to misspell that there for a second.
David's always telling me not to do math live, and I think
we
spelling
don't.
goes all in the same category.
I'll make sure to put those in the show notes so we have links to those.
Yeah.
I love the I would call it a recruiting page, but it's just a join now page for the Washington. One of my favorite, of course, is Miss Downing. She's such a sweetheart, and so it's fun to see her face there.
I love that picture, and it's pretty timeless, the joy that picture conveys.
Yeah.
And Mrs. Downing is a great friend of mine. I just picked her up a week ago and gave her a ride, and got to have a great car chat with her as we went on a little road trip for
in the top
hour or so.
Yeah, great group of girls, ladies and girls. Yeah. Anyway,
Thanks for that, David.
So first of all, Josephine, thank you again very much for being on the show. We appreciate you spending your time with us. And on behalf for everybody else out there listening, as usual, please check us out on the make comments on YouTube or whatever, so we're happy to get back to you when we can. And on behalf of Stephen and David and Craig and myself, thank you all for listening to the Working Tools Podcast. Goodbye.